Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everybody, wherever you are, wherever you're logging in from, and welcome to the first of the 2024-2025 African Literature Association lecture series. My name is Simon Lewis, and I'm sitting here in Charleston, South Carolina. I currently have the honor to be the Vice President of the ALA, and as the member of the ALA Executive Council, who's charged with coordinating these lectures, I'd like to take a minute or so to explain how we're operating. Our guest lecturers, Professors Tanure Ojaide and Lokangaka Losambe, are here on Zoom with me and our web whiz, Lexi Langendorf, while you are watching via the ALA YouTube site. Please, for a start, go ahead and let us know on the YouTube chat where you're logging in from, and feel free to post comments and questions whenever they occur to you during the presentation. Lexi and I will be monitoring the chat and feeding questions and comments to our presenters for the discussion after the lecture. We are having some difficulties. Professor Ojaide is fine on audio, but we don't yet have audio for Professor Losambe, so we might have some issues with that. We may end up being a little bit briefer today than we had anticipated. We shall see. Anyway, technical arrangements are those. We are here on Zoom, and you're watching via YouTube. So let me now briefly introduce our two presenters. They're here jointly because they are co-editors of this massive compendious collection of essays on the new African diasporic literature. It was many years in the making and finally appeared earlier this year from Routledge Press. Professor Lokangaka Losambe is the first of the editors mentioned on the book. He has enjoyed a stellar academic career that has seen him teaching in Nigeria, the Democratic Republic of Congo, in Swaziland, Eswatini, and the Republic of South Africa. Dr. Losambe held the position of the Dean of Faculty of the Arts and Chair of the Department of English for several years at the University of Fort Hare in South Africa, before moving to the University of Vermont, where he is currently the Frederick M and Fannie C.P. Corse Professor of English. I expect that ALA members of any length of standing will recall the memorable conference that Professor Losambe convened in Burlington that featured a keynote lecture by Wole Soyinka. The previous president of the ALA, Professor Losambe, has published a number of books, including Postcolonial Agency in African and Diasporic Literature and Film, a study in Globalectics, Borderline Movements in African Fiction, an introduction to the African Prose Narrative, Literature, the Visual Arts and Globalization in Africa and Its Diaspora, edited with Maureen Eke, and Pre-colonial and Post-colonial Drama and Theatre in Africa, edited with Devi Sarinjeive. So welcome to Dr. Losambe, and we hope you can get your sound sorted out in a short time. Alongside Dr. Losambe, we have one of Africa's most distinguished poet scholars, Professor Tanure Ojaide. In addition to his many award-winning poetry collections, Professor Ojaide has published novels, short stories, memoirs, as well as self-authored and co-authored and co-edited scholarly books. His creative work has also been the subject of literary scholarship, and he's had the honor of entire academic conferences dedicated to his work. His extensive list of prizes includes the Commonwealth Poetry Prize for the Africa region, the All-Africa Okigbo Prize for Poetry, the BBC Arts and Africa Poetry Award, and the Soyinka Prize for Literature in Africa. 2016 was something of an annus mirabilis for him. He won awards both sides of the Atlantic, winning the ALA's Fonlon-Nichols Award and the Nigerian National Order of Merit Award. In addition to all of those recognitions, he has also received NEH, Fulbright, and Carnegie Awards. He is currently the Frank Porter Graham Professor of Africana Studies at the University of North Carolina, Charlotte. Luckily, Dr. Ojaide was already planning to go first, so we'll hear from him in a minute. But welcome to you both, professors. Thank you both for being with us today. We are really fortunate to have two such dazzlingly accomplished lecturers here to kick this ALA series off for this year. So, Professor Ojaide, if you want to unmute yourself, the floor will be yours now. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you, Professor Lewis. I just want to thank you for putting us in this program, that you found that ALA found our work, the Routledge Handbook of the New African Diasporic Literature, important enough to be part of this ALA lecture series. So we are grateful for the honor you are giving us. I want also, on behalf, that's two of us, both Lokangaka and myself, to thank the audience, the listeners, for taking the time on a Saturday to listen to us in our presentation, which is the trends in the new African diasporic literature. And as Professor Lewis has told you earlier, this talk is based on a book, the Routledge Handbook of the New African Diasporic Literature. We already arranged to share the presentation, myself coming first. I'll talk about how we came about the concept of the New African Diaspora, and then the literature. And then later, my colleague, Professor Losambe, will take over. If it's not around, I will try to summarize the other part of the presentation to you. So I'll start talking about the trends in the new African diasporic literature. The New African Diaspora, which is a landmark collection of essays edited by Isidore Okweho and Nkiru Nzeku, conceptually brought to prominence the notion of the new African diaspora, previously debated in other edited collections by Koza and Konadu Ageman. So in his introduction to the volume, Okweho makes an important temporospatial distinction between the old pre-colonial and the new post-colonial African diaspora. In the latter, according to Okweho, the slave trade had been abolished and replaced by the establishment of Western European colonization over African nations and the exploitation of their natural resources. Africans in the pre-colonial diaspora have been mostly forced out of their societies into bondage, so they had no choice in their relocation to the Western world. So that's Okweho and Nzeku on the new African diaspora. And Ali Mazrui, gazing from the angle of power relations, further characterizes the old diaspora as the diaspora of enslavement and the new diaspora as the diaspora of imperialism. That's what you expect from Ali Mazrui, the diaspora of enslavement and the diaspora of imperialism, the old and the new. Following the same chronotopic demarcation and taking into account cultural diversity in diaspora formation, Paul Zeleza has also distinguished between what he calls the historic diasporas, that's the old diaspora, and the contemporary diaspora, that's the new diaspora. With regard to the contemporary diasporas, he has further identified three main characteristic waves: the diasporas of colonization, decolonization, and structural adjustment. This is what he writes. The diasporas of colonization would include the students who went to study abroad and stayed, seamen who became settlers, and many others who could migrate and become citizens according to the prevailing immigration regimes in the host countries. The diaspora of decolonization include, besides the so-called indigenous Africans, European and Asian settlers who relocated overseas during the struggle for independence and immediately after. The diasporas of structural adjustment have been formed since the 1980s out of the migrations engendered by economic, political, and social crisis and the destabilization of structural adjustment programs. They include professional elites, traders, refugees, and students. So in this volume, we used the label New African Diaspora as it is constituted by the three main waves described above. And we agree with Zelezda that a precondition for the transition from a migrant into a diasporan is prolonged settlement, followed by permanent resettlement in a new host country. We see that we are talking about the diaspora. The migration is a process, but the diaspora is a settlement, permanent settlement. So our book, the Routledge Handbook of the New African Diasporic Literature, is a comprehensive companion that introduces students, literature scholars, general readers of world literature to the transnational and multivocal writings of immigrant African authors produced in Europe, North America, and elsewhere in the world. So, and these writings are discussed in three major aesthetic paradigms that we label the Sankofa wave, that's from 1960s to the 1980s, the Janusian wave, 1990s to 2020s, and the offshoots of the new arrivants, those born have grown up outside Africa. So there are three main waves: the Sankofa, the Janusian, and the offshoots of the new arrivants. So I will talk about the Sankofa wave in a minute. Who are those people? Who are the members of the Sankofa wave? They include Abdulrazak Gona, Ngugi wa Thiong'o, Kurapetse Ngosisile, Dennis Brutus, Zoe Wickham, Christopher Hope, Buchi Emecheta, Isidore Okweho, Ben Okri, Niyo Shundari, my humble self, Tanure Ojaide, Tesonweme, Silcheni Koka, Jacques Mapanje, Emmanuel Dongala, Paz Ngadu Kashama, and a host of others. So we're writing just about the African immigrants settled outside of Africa. So the Sankofa wave, the mythical bird, that Akan, Ashanti mythical bird, is supposed to be moving forward while still gazing backwards. And we see that as, in a way, trying to connect, reconnect, and reconcile with the mother continent, Africa. So this group of modern African writers experienced firsthand their indigenous African cultures, from colonialism to political independence of their respective countries. These are writers who had already established themselves in their creative writing careers in their respective African home countries before immigrating in the late 1960s through the 1970s, 1980s, and the 1990s. These decades of emigration from Africa coincided with the period of apartheid in South Africa, military coups, and post-independence civil wars and unrest, IMF economic measures of austerity, which devastated African economic and social lifestyles, and massive corruption in the affairs of state. Thus, while some were forced out of Africa into exile, like Ngosisile, Dennis Brutus, Jacques Mapanje, and Frank Chipasula, the other members of this group of African diasporic writers left following instability, the crunching economic situation in the continent, and other personal reasons. One can posit from their intimate African home experiences that they are Sankophan as they simultaneously look backward, even as they move forward. Memory of Africa has a consistent presence in most of their works. The socio-political, economic, and cultural states of the new nations are often the focus of these writers. As pointed out by Abiola Ireli, African historical experiences serve as a constant reference for the African imagination because through colonialism and neocolonialism, the West has cast Africa as the other in order to enforce its self-affirmation as a unique source of human and spiritual values. So we can see in the new, in this group of African writers, you see writers making use of folklore. You have an example like Ngugi, and he uses the folklore, Gikuyu folklore, to satirize the poor national leadership while conscientizing the multitudes for revolutionary actions. In fiction and poetry in particular, this use of oral literary resources gives the new diasporic literary works a cultural identity. While Ngugi represents the trend in fiction, poets such as Silcheni Koka, Jack Mapanje, Lupenga Mfande, Frank Chipasula, Neo Shundari, Ojaide, they seem to have brought their aesthetic preoccupations in Africa into their respective diasporic creative repertoires, even while addressing global issues such as climate change and human destruction of the environment. However, Isidore Okwekwo in Call Me By My Rightful Name brings together the two diasporas. You know, this is a novel in which an African American using language tries to go to Africa to find his origin, and then there's sort of reconciliation. So there's an attempt to reconnect the old and the new diaspora in Isidore Okwekwo. Let me just give you some of the essays in the Sankophan wave. There are two groups here, the Anglophone perspectives and the Francophone perspectives. Gichingiri in the Girigi writes about the shape-shifter in Ngugi, Watungo's migrant writing. Simon Keith Lewis, our host, writes on Abdurazak Gurna and Vies Naipaul, Memory of Departure versus Enigma of Arrival. Joya Ureze, Paradise Destroyed, Exile and Diaspora in Abdurazak Gurna's Paradise, and Novel Bulawayo's We Need New Names. Dika Okoro writes on diaspora as motif in the poetry of Jacques Mapanje, Frank Chipasula, and Lupenga Mfande. There are other articles by Uhuru Pocha Falafala on Ngosisile, Akono writes on Dennis Brutus, Stefan Hegosin on Zoe Wickham, Peter Blair, busy with the towing and throwing diasporic prose of the new South Africa. Obi Okolocha writes on cultural displacement, identity, and home in Buche Mecheta's diasporic fiction. Rosemary Gray writes on Ben Okri's diasporic consciousness, and so on and so forth, through essays on Neo Shundari, Antijan Sala, essays on Tanure Ojaide, essays on Funsho Ayejina, essays on Africa. This is important on drama. There were a few essays on drama, but this essay written by Mabel Evieroma, New African Diasporic Drama, Nigerian Meaning-Making, Identities, and Ethos. Essays by Maureen Eke, Annalena Tuavanen. Honoré Misihun writes on Ivoirité, Itanela Bonis Exile Discourse, Zainab Ango on Venonitajo, and Kasongo Kapanga on Congolese transnational diasporic writers and their multi-pronged fights. So that is the Sankofa wave, the oldest form, the oldest group, the Sankofa group. I don't know whether my colleague, Professor Losambe, is ready. Losambe?
Oh, okay. Are you hearing me now?
Yeah.
Okay. So it is working. Okay. I have tried something else. I'm so sorry. We had some problems at the beginning, and now I think it has been sorted out. Thank you very much, Simon and Alexi, for taking care of the technical aspect as we address as we go on addressing the topic. Right. So as Tanure has just indicated, I will now start with the Janusian wave. The Janusian wave authors, also called Afropolitans, occupy a third space. And now I'm using Homi Bhabha's concept, which also I have elaborated on in a previous work. Like the two-faced Roman god of transition, openness, connection, and the creative articulation of the past and the present for progressive future, they simultaneously cast a critical gaze upon three life worlds: the African society they originate from, the Western world they presently live in, and the humanistic or globalistic consciousness they project. The new humanism, or the transnational consciousness articulated in the writings of these new diasporic authors, reflects what Abiola Irelé's idea, Abiola Irelé's idea of African literature as a conjunction of creative impulses refracting local and the global issues of our time. Writers like Adichie, Abani, Atta, Oyeyemi, Selassie, Noviole, Bulawayo, Gabiba, and a host of others, and a host of others, then are unified in the articulation of a transnational post-colonial conjunctive consciousness, which promotes what Spivak calls a collective rearrangement of desires, which is a condition of possibility of a convivial humanity, as proposed by Guillory. The writings draw effectiveness and a compelling vitality from the author's masterful combination of aspects of what Abiola Ilele has called aesthetic traditionalism, that is cultural interpolation, and the metonic gap, as Ashcroft has indicated, the neorealism, which combines the grotesque, the magical, the metonymic, the metaphoric, and the shifting points of view in an episodic and narrative structure, and neo-humanistic aesthetic, which enlists an ellipsis, textual collage, social media, cyberspace, especially the blog sphere, text as important narrative techniques. This sophisticated, complex arsenal of narrative techniques makes the writings of this generation transformative as they bring to the surface globally repressed, anachronistic, and melancholic attitudes about class, race, gender, sexuality, disability, religion, nationality, ethnicity, migrancy, transnational identities, and the environment. The art is to a certain extent akin to the new poetics, which, to quote Rancière, quote, frames a new hermeneutics taking upon itself the task of making society conscious of its own secret by leaving the noisy stage of political claims and the doctrines and delving into the depth of the social to disclose the enigmas and the fantasies hidden in the intimate realities of everyday life, end quote. Chris Abani has cogently described the creative project of this generation of the new African diasporic writers as a transnational and liberated from the cultural nationalism found in the writings of the early generations of African writers. In an interview with the Goyav, Abani has stated that his generation, quote, his generation is doing exciting work. And it's about my work. It is in many ways post-national and the global, not only in its reach, but in its attempt to locate a very specific African sensibility without attempting to limit it with certain kinds of arguments about essentiality and so forth, end quote. Whether writing in French, in English, or other European languages, many new African diasporic writers, including Adichie and others I have just mentioned above, have time again articulated this sense of what I have called somewhere else transnational post-colonial conjunctive consciousness in various interviews about their lives and in their respective creative projects. Most of them have refused to be narrowly zoned and labeled African writers. For example, when I asked the question whether she would describe herself and writing as African in an interview with Aminata Forna, Adichie responds, I quote, "Being labeled an African writer is something I'm uncomfortable with, but also proud of. Proud because it's a heritage that I embrace. Uncomfortable because it is a loaded term and often one that is given to you by somebody else. If it didn't come with a baggage, then it will be fine, but it does, and because of that, there is some discomfort," end quote. That's what Adichie says about his African connection. In the same interview, Oyeyemi also expresses the same discomfort, stating that, quote, "African writer can pigeonhole you because when you walk into bookshops, you often see a lot of great Nigerian or African writers being put into categories such as Black interest or African interest. That is annoying." That is what she says, end quote. As Guyala has remarked, Abani has resisted various labels of a Nibo writer, a British writer, a Los Angeles writer, Black writer, African writer, or Nigerian writer. In an interview with Claire Chambers, for instance, Leila Abulela, a Sudanese writer has also resisted being narrowly defined by one cultural site, stating that there are three things that together make up my identity, I quote, Sudan, Egypt, and Britain, end quote. Ahmed Wahala is therefore right when he points out in his research that the transnational consciousness that informs Abulele's creative writing emanates from her conjunctive consciousness that questions all those. As he says, daughter of an Egyptian mother and a Sudanese father, and at the same time brought up as westernized environment of a private American school, Abulela has always been turned to cultural, has always been tuned to cultural negotiations across heterogeneous geographies, ethnicities, and languages in Cairo, Khartoum, Jakarta, Abu Dhabi, and so forth, end quote. And so what we have indicated here, the difference between them, the Sankofa and the Janusian, is that instead of reducing what I have seen in a number of critical writings talking about the old concept of a culture conflict, it is not necessarily that there is a certain subjective consciousness that is diasporic, that is projected when those writers refuse to totally belong. And so they projected that kind of globalist consciousness that is then diasporic, where they talk with authority as they gaze simultaneously at the society they live in and its pitfalls, but also the society they come from and its pitfalls, and using symbols drawn from both they are able to effectively express that neo-humanistic vision in their writings, which is really post-colonial. That is what I call conjunctive consciousness. And that is what we see in the Janusian, because then they, at the same time, cast the critical gazes at once, and while pointing out, not necessarily like they are experiencing a conflict, but they assume that a subjective consciousness that is designed to look for a new rearrangement of desires in our global time. And so from there, I go to these ones we call the offshoots of the new arrivants, those who were born here and are now learning about Africa. And then, but most of the time their aesthetic is also an imbrication. It's really a conjunction of all what they are experiencing here, including the American, the British, and themselves, the influences from the other waves. So the term arrivants included in our description of the third wave of the new African diasporic writers, borrowed from a Kamau Braithwaite's poetic trilogy entitled The Arrivants, which was published in 1988, that depicts lived experiences of the early members of the African historical diaspora, their environment, their expressive popular culture, spirituals, jazz, folk music, oral tales, in a new world, as depicted in the poems that comprise the trilogy. The enslaved African arrivants were carriers and makers of historical and imbricated cultural memories that they bequeathed to their offshoots and subsequent generations. With regard to the new African diasporic arrivants, their offshoots draw inspiration for their creative projects, not only from the artistic corpus of members of the historical and the new African diaspora, but also from the works of other contemporary authors in word literature. Thus, the third wave that we call the offshoots of the new arrivants comprises those born and who grew up in the new diasporic space. Such writers often refuse to be entangled with Africa and mostly draw their aesthetic and thematic inspirations from Western authors and the literary traditions, including African American and Caribbean literatures. As Zeleza has stated, unlike the parents, these offshoots of the new arrivants are, I quote, fully socialized into the experiences and identities of the historical diaspora, end quote. They invoke Black history into the quotidian to decenter the West from within, as they affirm the inevitable connectivity that the initial encounters between the West and the rest of the world sedimented. Legitimately claiming space within English, American, French, Portuguese, and other European literary traditions, they give expression to the historically and the presently marginalized Black subjects. Unlike the Janusian wave diasporic writers discussed above, these writers connect with and experience Africa through physical visits, archival research, and oral stories that they often produce as documentaries or integrate into their fictional narratives, drama, and poetry. Writers in this new diasporic category include a Nigerian British poet and novelist Bernardine Evaristo, Sierra Leonean British novelist Aminata Forna, Nigerian British novelist Helen Oyeyemi, Nigerian British poet and playwright Inua Elams, Somali British poet Warsan Shire, Ghanaian British novelist Taye Selassie, Nigerian American novelist and the photographer Tejo Cole, Ghanaian American novelist Ya Gyasi, Senegalese French novelist Maureen Eke, Angolan Portuguese novelist Yara Monteiro, Angolan Portuguese novelist Jimala de Almeida, and the Cape Verdean novelist Joaquim Arena, and a Nigerian, Jamaican, South African novelist Yewande Omotosho. So this is how this is again a number of essays. I'm not going to, because to save the time, since we want to allow some time for questions. I am not going to go through the essays because we have 46 chapters dealing with with all those authors and in all the genres that we know in literature. So this book is unique both in its scholarly content and scope, as it covers all the genres. Instead of reductively assimilating the new diasporic literature influenced by multiple aesthetic sensibilities into the continental concept of African literature, as other guides have done, and in this case I refer to Olakule George and Deyum, Mora Deyum Adejumobi's anthologies as well. We regard it as a major part of the distinct larger African diasporic literary tradition, written by well-established and emerging scholars of African and diasporic literature from across the world. The chapters cover the works of well-known and not so well-known Anglophone, Francophone, and Lusophone writers from different theoretical positionality and the critical approaches. In so doing, the chapters point out the unique, innovative artistic qualities of this major subgenre of African literature. The focus on the diasporic consciousness of the writers and their works put this book on a different pedestal from others that solely emphasize migration, which is more of a process than the community of settled African people involved in the dynamic act of living outside Africa, reflected in the diasporic writings. And so this is what the book is really, putting forward, mainly those major paradigms in the construction of the new diasporic literature. Again, well, I will stop there and see whether and of course interact more with the audience.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Professor Losambe. I'm so glad we could get your sound issues fixed up. And between the two of you, you've given a really good sense of the incredible scope of this thing. This is a massive, great tome. And you've described your three, what you call aesthetic paradigms.
That's right.
But I'm curious whether you had those three categories in mind when you put out your call for contributions to the volume, or whether that particular set of categories emerged in the process of your receiving contributions from people. In other words, did you have when you sent out the call, did you say it needs to fit one of these three patterns, or did you then realize as all of the essays came in that they actually fell into those three kinds of category?
Yes, I will address that. So when we started, we had an idea that, I have written a little bit about the new African diaspora in a previous book, and Tanure has dealt a lot with the Sankofa, but also, so we had an idea that certainly looking at the landscape of the new diasporic writings, we could then discern those three trends, but we didn't then tell those writers. So when we picked up, we solicited contributions. We didn't necessarily make a general call for papers, but we targeted some individuals who have worked within those areas, and what came again confirmed our assumptions when we started with those categories, because then we could see clearly that it was confirming both in terms of the critical analysis of different works and different writers. We could group them really from the way we thought before, and so that was really again a confirmation of the assumption that we had worked with from the beginning.
Interesting. Did anything take you by surprise? Make you rethink the categorization at all, or was it simply confirmation?
It was more confirmation. So the only, what I will think that the African dimension, for instance, the essay by Christopher Uma on Yeonde Omotosho, but also Martha Ndakaloka on the Zimbabwean Kenyan, and this led us to see that okay, probably we should have, but of course in a volume you have some limitations, but it could have led us into intra-African migration and a different paradigm in the kind of multiple influences there that are not necessarily coming from outside, but then dealing within that context with the contemporary realities and the new aesthetics and the performances which influence those writings within Africa. And so it became something that we thought it needed another public volume to deal with that, with the intra-African diasporic writers, if it could be called that. But we have a couple of essays there that really, that dealt with, but the projecting that others could, do further.
So at no point were you tempted to try a different kind of division according to reasons for migration, exile, refugee, professionalism, anything like that? You're happy just to keep them in these essentially generational divisions?
Yes, but within the generation, because then when we see, for instance, okay, the whole of new diaspora, and you remember in an introduction, I thought we wanted to deal that the discussion started really in about 1997, and I was visiting at the University of Pittsburgh at that time, and then Isidoro Opeo, Abiola Areli, Ali Mazuri, and others, they had organized a major conference at Ohio State University, where Apia was there and all those people, and it was really to discuss the concept of the new diaspora of Africans who have come, and the meaning of even the department, how we should call it. Is it Department of Black Studies? We continue to call those departments that have a concentration on African and African American literatures and Black Studies, or should do. And it is that a discussion that led towards Ali Mazuri, for instance, coming up with a context of with the concept of American Africans. that was at that point, and there was really a lot of discussions about that, and it followed again. Isidoro Opeo took it up, and when he went to Binghamton with the Carol and others, they organized a series of seminars, which led to the book as well. And in those discussions, we saw that people came mainly, and if you look at it in the 80s or in the 70s, the migration was not when the economies of African countries were doing well, the 70s, even towards the early 80s. At that time, they were visiting scholars from Africa, but they were going back. Writers were coming and going through and back. But you see, it is in the 80s that we saw people like Isidoro Opeo with the collapse of the economies there, IMF coming in, working conditions that became very difficult. Writers, had a tough time, people, scholars functioning, and it is when we started seeing the migration really that led towards a settlement at that point. And it was a voluntary, because you could still go back, but it is. But then there are some others like Ngugi, because of the political situation, or Mudimbe, because of the political situation, he couldn't go back to the Congo. And so those ones were in exile again. And so they had even if they had wanted to go, they couldn't. And so they became part of, dealing with African problems while being here, like Dennis Montes and others as well. But then you have the 90s, where the economic situation again came up, and the desire to interact in terms of scholarship to have access to the resources and have that fruitful interaction and with other scholars, and people started coming, settling down and going and coming, and so this is generally it's kind of voluntary, but also there was also that the political situation in the 80s when some people could not go back because they had said things about income. So those are the major, so we could say voluntary, movements, but also within it, you have intellectual engagements, the facilities that the people thought they could have in order to foster, more, develop their imagination more and more as scholars or writers, but always going back and through and others that way. So we have a lot of.
So there's a question from Joy Orezi in the chat, which is a little bit related to this. I think it says, please elaborate on how you decided on using those particular terms and not others, such as Afropolitan. And maybe
Yes.
Tanure, you can have a go at that, because I'm curious about both of your experience as immigrants is a little different, because Tanure, yours has simply been a one-way motion between across the Atlantic, but Loka, yours has been a process of step migration from one country to another, and then finally to the United States. Did you had Sankophon, Janusian, and New Arrivants?
Mm-hmm.
What about Afropolitan as a phrase?
Yeah, but Tanure, you want to comment on that?
Let me comment on that. Yeah,
I can also do that afterwards.
Yeah. What we've done, Afropolitans are part of the Janusian wave. In fact, there are also Afropeans, that's European Africans, Afropeans, which are there. They're also part of the Janusian. A detailed reading. We didn't have time to really talk about the different groups, even within groups. So the Janusian group has Afropolitans, has Afropeans, and others. And so I don't think there was any problem for us, since we are using the chronotopic type of way of settling the waves. Those that came first, then those who were already made, they were already made as Africans before. Some were already established, some were getting established. We know those ones, and they brought those qualities to the north, from the south to the north. And then you have the Afropolitans and the Afropeans, those after the 2000 who came, they're very different from those who came earlier. So that's where you have the Afropolitans and the Afropeans in them. They belong to that Janusian wave, which my colleague Lokangaka has talked so much about. So I don't think there was any problem in using the terms we've used. We've used terms we feel these are terms, you see that we've borrowed some from literary ancestors, so to say, from Isidore Kweho, from Ali Mazri, and from Zeleze. We've borrowed terms which we've used. We are not trying to just bring in new terms. There are groups that call themselves names, like the Afropolitan, used by Selassie, or
I can't hear you again. Sorry, I can't hear you.
Here we go.
Okay, yeah. So they belong to the Janusian wave, and I don't see there was any problem fitting them into that section. I think the sections are quite quite clear. We may have a problem in the future. There's so many Africans going out now, and these are going to write. And so are they still in the Janusian group, or what group are we going to put such? They are not. Those don't belong to the offshoots of the arrivants. These are new people going now, coming to settle in the global north. What will they be in 10 years, 20 years time, and so forth? That could be the problem. For now, what we've done so far, I think seems to us very clear, and we've tried to make it as clear as possible.
Okay,
Yeah.
thank you.
Can I comment? Add something to that, Simon. I know we have some time, but so the concept of Afropolitanism, still, we know the debate around it as well. But also, it is very much rooted in also the concept of cosmopolitanism itself, because it suggests more almost like, again, when reading it, even when in various shades, it's an African, the movement to, let's say, city to a new environment, and then you adapt and others. But it is not, this is not, the Janusian then is not necessarily like dealing very much with adapting and acting according to the Romans where you are, but rather making interventions, and that is moving into that global diasporic scene, and then exercising agency in pointing out, in this case, the pitfalls of our world from where they come from and where they want to live, that make it impossible for us to be able to live in a conviviality and a difference. And so in doing that, they are not necessarily adjusting to the American. On the contrary, they are critical of what makes it impossible for them to relate to the people there in a convivial way, who will respect the difference, who have probably what Adichie calls one story. But also the other side is the side that is also the same things you find there. They still colonize mentality that privileges also the Western world, so that you see the way we see in Americana and many others. And so you see that they kind of, they become more activistic in the exercising the agency in trying to really promote, a humanistic, a new humanistic world where we become ourselves one another's keeper, and also the difference is respected, that you could live, in other words, the borders, undermining the borders, as it were. And so that, as you see in those works, morally, you will think that when a person is in becoming or undermining immigration processes, of forging papers and doing things like that, morally you will think, but no, in reality, the way they are deployed, it is almost like, it became almost like carnivalesque activities designed to undermine, those the politics that then that are colonial, as a matter of fact, that impede our acknowledgement of a difference within, with the values and promoting that global humanistic consciousness, where we could live anywhere you want and they do. So those writers, and they're not necessarily African writers, but we see the same thing with Asian diasporic writers. And so these are, and they influence one another, because when I read, sometimes I see some other Asian writers whose works I read, almost like overlapping with expressing. And so it is because of that, that when it is when their work or their aesthetic is reduced to conflict, it becomes then associated with cosmopolitanism, a person who doesn't adjust. You see, so the Janusian then has that sense of creative agency, that looking simultaneously both there and projecting a new way that then makes, that leads us towards a rearrangement of desires, where we become probably comfortable with one another in our global world, and then we can intervene always. So the sense of agency and activistic tone that is created by their aesthetics, and also the technique, the arsenal, the devices they use there, and the techniques where characters sometimes will go, what I have called in and out of slippages, and telling you what it could be and out of that. And so that's, I think that because of that, we tried also to avoid see some limitations in the Afropolitanism, but rather the janusian being much more descriptive of the agency of that new generation of writers that have created that third space of intervention on inadequacies of our world.
Okay, so that's Janusian and Afropolitan. There's a question here from Maridu, and I'm going to read it out, and then I'm going to carry on talking. So I'll give you a little bit of chance to think about the question. First off, she says, "Congrats on a truly expansive volume. I like the distinction between migration and settlement." And then here's the question: wouldn't you say that the Sankophone wave fits both African and African diasporic literature? So wouldn't you say that the Sankophone wave fits both African and African diasporic literature? And while you think about that, I'm just going to put the announcement into the YouTube chat about next year's ALA conference, which is going to happen in Nairobi. I hope everybody knows that already. And the deadline for receipt of abstracts is in November the 15th. So that should be popping in the chat in a minute if I can figure out how to do that. Should be going. I can't remember. I can't figure out how to do it. Anyway, that is the deadline for the receipt of abstracts. So I will try and get that into the chat in due time. But anyway, back to that question about the Sankophone and
yes, that's a very interesting question, and that is the reason why we use that term Sankofa to describe that, because they could be, it will be, I cannot imagine a situation where Neo Shunare, Tanure Ojaide are not seen as African writers. As we have said, those were established writers in Africa before coming here, and in their operation, in their aesthetics, the storehouse of values they came from tend to resonate, to ring all the time. There is a return to those symbols, these metaphors, these from there, and the preoccupation, including the themes. And so, for that reason, as Moradeum has suggested and has done in those volumes, they are really, they could be claimed to be African, but at the same time, diasporic writers. And that is, it is not something that is strange, as we know about Henry James, for instance, who is studied as an American writer, but also as a British writer, the way we study him. T.S. Eliot, we are, you know, those writers can be claimed, you know, they are, as you're saying, putting them, they started writing in Africa, and they became famous, so in fact, within that milieu. And what they have done is almost like a continuation of that, except that they live here. But if you see, most of them keep on returning there. They have homes more than many others, you know, who spend longer times in things. So I think I agree that they fit, the Sankophone really, you know, wave will fit into both. I don't know whether Tanure has something else.
I'm part of the issue.
You yourself.
I don't think that's what remains African. See, that's why it's called. See, the diasporic is describing the African. It's a new diasporic African literature. It's an extension. It's a broadening of the African literature. See, these writers are not going to be taken as African American writers, or are going to be taken as American writers, no matter how long somewhere like Peter Ben Okri lives in Britain, he's not going to be seen as a British writer. So I think we are first and foremost African writers before anything else. A time might come in future when they could integrate so much that they are no longer African writers, even at a distance, either offshoots of African or Janusian. But for now, I think we remain African. I see myself an African. I live in North Carolina, and the Arts Council, I've got their awards. I've been the writer of the month. But they ask me, why is it that you're always writing about only Africa? And I tell them that I'm responding. Everybody, we have a cultural sensibility, and I respond to things as an African. And so I think one can be a diasporan writer, an African writer at the same time. And especially for the Sankofa group. Those were, see, when somebody has gone beyond about 17, 18, that person is almost formed. And no matter where you go, you're almost that person you've been. So you cannot I cannot say I'm not an African because I've stayed here. I was already formed, like most of the writers we've looked at, Ngugi, Ni Oshundari, others, we were already formed before we came to the north, the global north. And so I remain an African writer, and I can't be anything else because literature itself, let me bring that up. Literature is a cultural production. It's mostly a cultural production. To the Africans, it's a cultural production. It has some function to play. And by the time most of these writers are still writing in that African way, aesthetic way. That's what we talk about, aesthetic and thematic paradigms. As long as those paradigms and these things are used, we remain African, I would think.
Yeah.
So
that's
where I see it. Yeah.
Because there's a sort of overlap in some ways. You do refer to them as aesthetic paradigms, but they're also in terms of generation. So it's kind of an interesting thing. Maureen has a follow-up. She says she's asking because questions of diasporic and multiple identities seem important for the Janusian and the new Arrivants wave, but not for the Sankofan wave. Would you agree with that, Tanure?
Yeah, I would think so.
Yeah. Yes, I do.
So.
And I also agree because that's those writers themselves state it. If you in various interviews, the Sankofan will give what the Tanure is saying, and then the Janusian will refuse really to totally.
Yeah, I can't say that. I can't talk about double identity, or I should not be described as an African writer like some of the Janusian writers. I'm African. Yeah. Fully African.
Here's a question that takes us in a slightly different direction from Gideon Brobe. And by the way, I just want to comment again that we've got an audience from all over the world. We've got people in Canada, Nigeria, the UK, all over the United States. So that's great. Thank you, everybody, for being here on the call with us today. Here's a question, though, from Gideon. It says, could you comment on the temporary African colonial migrants to the colonial metropoles as the beginning of the Sankofa movement? I talk of texts, characters in Ethiopia Unbound, and so on. So,
you wanted to take it to I would like to think that, Ethiopia Unbound, it is almost like the way we have, you could link that generation of writers with, for instance, the negritude writers, Senghor and others who went to France for a time, and then Africa was really their preoccupation in all the negotiations from that assertive. The same thing with the case of Hayford, the Ethiopian bound or child of towards by the Kenyan writer. Most of them really will fit very well within the Sankofan tradition. Those are the people who came to study, but they probably, wanted to go back home, and its home was always, central. And I think it should be the same, the Sankofa. I don't know. You want to add something?
Not much to add. Before we put Ngosisile, remember he came before even apartheid. Yeah, he came. He came early. And in fact, he was part of the African American black movement. At the same time, it's very African. And in fact, one could say that he influenced African American to have a lot of the features of African literature. And when he returned to Africa. And we feel that, in fact, we put him as the beginning of the Sankofan group, this group of Africans coming in, and whereby came at a very early stage and stayed for such a long time. So
Yeah, so we've got another question in the chat, which you have you mentioned, Loka, when you were talking. He says, "Can we talk of diasporic writers within Africa?" And I think you've suggested we certainly can. Is the concept of diasporic limited to writers of African descent based in the global North? I don't know if you want to address that. It sounds like it might be a topic for your next
That's right.
massive collection.
Yes, as we have said, you see, Christopher Umar wrote a very, very good essay on Oyewande Motor Show, and the other one. So you have, in the case of, so we have intra-African migration or diaspora in this case, and it is much more. I wonder whether we can still talk about African in a sense of Nigerian diaspora within Africa, or these are the concepts that we have now to start dealing with deconstructing Africa that way, since everything is happening within the African continent itself. And so you have the movement from Nigeria to South Africa, from South Africa to from the Congo to Nigeria. And so when it is intra like that, it is African diaspora within then, and so, which is a big concept. But then you could see that there are certain aesthetic patterns emerging in the creativity as those writers then, well, deconstructing even Africa. It is going outside the colonial concept of Africa as the same, as we know, and you know, using the decolonial pattern and things that look. In Africa, we have many ethnic groupings, we have many traditions, and as I was saying, that when I lived in Nigeria for about 10 years, and the whole time I was in Nigeria, I came across, I lived in Yoruba land, and some practices were similar, others really completely, you know, different, the language and all the signs, the symbols, and relating to life, and so if I were creating in that sense, I was also, I became almost like living there and living there, and also almost like many people elsewhere will write a Nigerian critic when I'm not necessarily a Nigerian critic, but I lived in Nigeria and the functioning in Ibadan with all the writers and others. I became also, to a certain extent, influenced in my thinking by the Ibadan school of that time. I suggested that probably we should write a book about Ibadan in the 70s and the 80s, because there was really a very strong, vibrant literary culture at that time that has continued until today, starting from taking over from Soyinka and others who were there before. Yeah. And so you had those influences. So you take them with you somewhere else, and you cannot really be created totally independent of the experiences or the lived experiences. And so those conjunction of those lived experiences will indicate that a new, in your vision, a certain new, paradigm of creativity will emerge. So it is necessary for us to address that. That is, at the moment, really, it's like we don't have a volume that deals with that all the time.
Let me add something. See, the concept of the diaspora itself, do we use race as part of the definition of diaspora? And if we're to use race, if you are going moving, if there's a Yoruba group in Ghana, or there's a Hausa group in Eritrea, or a lot of Hausa groups in Sudan, is that really a diaspora? These are things we have to look at. I think we have to really examine more the concept of the diaspora, where it has to do more, it has to do with race rather than just ethnic groupings. That somebody moves from Nigeria to settle in South Africa. There are many Nigerians who settled in the Sudan. They were going on the Hajj and they settled there. A lot of Hausa people settled in southern Egypt and the Sudan. Hausa people in Eritrea, Yoruba people in Ghana. Is that really? I think we can discuss it, but I don't think they fit into the diaspora we're talking about, where it's like a race moving out of your racial spatial limit, so to say, homeland. If you are moving from the African homeland, sub-Saharan Africa, for instance, you move within the same special geography. Is that a diaspora? I think I work on folklore of Africa and the African diaspora, and I take the African as a race. And before the African, when we look at the first diaspora, the African Americans, we know they came from Africa, the race, to a different place. Can we say the same thing, that if we move from within Africa to another part of Africa, once we do that, you can also look at migration even within nations. There are a lot of my Yoruba people who move into Yoruba area to work and settle there. In fact, they say...
You muted yourself again, Tanure.
That an honorable governor of Ogun State might have been an honorable person. But is that really the diaspora? So I think we should, I don't know, but I want us to discuss whether race is, I think, it's an important part of the diaspora. And if it's an important part of the diaspora, if you move within Africa, if you move from Yoruba land into Yoruba land, does that make a diaspora? You move from, that's my, I think something we should debate more about.
So migration is a part of diaspora, but it's not necessarily the same as diaspora. Diaspora is something kind of bigger.
Diaspora is more,
good. And you bring up the question of race, and you've mentioned Khositsile earlier on, being in the States in 1960s, in exile. One of the things that's really interesting to me in a lot of the new African diasporic literature is the relationship between the members of the new African diaspora and the old African diaspora. That is the relationship between Africans and African Americans, for instance. You see it obviously most plainly, I think, in Americana, Adicie's book. But it seems to me that in the 1960s, when Khositsile was here, there was a kind of overlap of racial consciousness, that the civil rights movement was coinciding with the movement towards Black independence on the continent. And so there was a kind of cohesion at that point between those people of those two generations. It didn't matter whether they were African American, the old diaspora, or whether they were the new diaspora, which is the Khositsiles. But any longer, that relationship, especially coming out in the fiction, seems to be a little bit more fraught than that.
Yes.
Can you comment on that?
Yes, and we have an essay actually tweeting by Joseph, who the essay that starts that part. It's examining those conflicts, and so that's something that we see the janusian sometimes, like in Americana, we see that dimension of some kind of suspicion, conflict, as it were, where there was that kind of a general conditioning, where there was apartheid there, and then you have a civil rights movement here, and so apartheid then became, or civil rights became also a site of engagement with what was happening also in Africa, even the colonialism and others. That has to a certain extent disappeared now, which is the reason why you see that even in the African Literature Association, at the beginning, you had a lot of African Americans in that association. Now you can account how many African Americans come in again. There is, because the new diaspora deploying itself as a distinct grouping within the diasporic space, as in contrast to the old diaspora. Then you come with some other issues, some problems, certainly, as they interact, some suspicion, because, well, sometimes people thinking that, okay, coming from a colonial, you probably have some kind of affiliations different from others, or going some of those old problems like you saw does before, or things like, so you have, as you have said, Simon, that cohesion is no longer there as it was before, and reinforcing the word of the new diaspora, which is at the same time looking at those problems as well, and presenting and pointing out also some of the problems arising from the conflict between those two as pitfalls, some weaknesses that then in this case will probably encourage anachronistic views to continue. So you have that situation of and that's the merit of Americana. Americana being only that, but not only that, but also even the different racial groupings and what we call the Olympics of people then now positioning themselves. And so it's an important, that's a chapter, a number of people really examining that kind of context and reinforcing the deconstruction of the diasporic concept itself. Mm-hmm.
Tanure, any comment on that?
I would think, see, in the 60s or before the 60s, that Pan-African type of movement that was around. See, we don't have statesmen among Black people almost everywhere. See, when you think of people that came from the Caribbean into the United States, they go from the United States to Africa and so forth. We don't have such people who can bring people together. Rather, these are people who are struggling for daily existence. And when people are struggling for daily existence, you feel, oh, some people are coming and taking up our jobs and so forth. So I think the lack of statesmen among African Americans, among Caribbeans, among Africans, and so I think we're not doing well. Leaders of those days brought us together. If you know that people like Martin Luther King went for the inauguration of Kwame Nkrumah, Malcolm X came to Ibadan, and people are coming, people came like that. We don't have that type of thing. And when you leave these people struggling for positions that the mainstream will give, I think there are bound to be such things. So we don't have idealistic thinkers or people who bring us together as used to be in those days. So I think that's why there are problems. There are no problems really, but people can create problems where there are no problems.
Yeah, interesting.
Yeah.
Joya Urazi has given a little comment. Shout out to you, Tanure. Given how racism featured prominently in 18th century categorizations of race, she says, believe intellectuals like you can redefine race on your own terms. That's fine. So you've got license there.
It's not so. Some people met, some Europeans met and said they have these color codes they gave to people. So you cannot say that we can define on our own terms, but a European will not say it's not a European. If we not say it's a European, there's no way a European will say it's not a European. There's no way a nation will say it's not from, let's say Chinese or Japanese. Let me take such. So those cultures are very strong. They cannot. It's only some Africans who feel, oh, you don't need to be African. But I think your cultural, whether race or culture, is very important in human beings' formation. And why is it that if you go to University of London, if you go to bookstores, they will arrange books, and you have English literature. No matter how long V.S. Naipaul has stayed there, no matter how long Ben Okri has stayed there, their books are not in English literature. Mm-hmm. And race doesn't matter. It matters. Mm-hmm. Why should some people feel it doesn't matter when it matters?
Yeah, so that was the topic of my book. My essay in your book, by the way, was Naipaul's attempt at English.
Yes. Right? Very excellent. That is the reason it was very nice.
Yeah. So I think, see, those who gain from some advantage, those who have advantages from special areas can say, oh, there's nothing there. For those who could be persecuted or suppressed or anything because of race, they will say there's something in it, I think. I don't think it's important, but I think it's there.
It's a reality. It becomes a reality.
Yeah.
So I was looking up before this, looking up Novaya Bulawayo's We Need New Names.
Yeah.
Because the intercalary chapters in that book are so interesting, that how we came, how they came, and so on. And I was struck by this one very, very telling comment. Says there's no journey without a price. So I wonder if when you were reading these essays, whether your sense was of diaspora as a gain or a loss or a balance between those things.
Yeah, when I read I went through those essays. Sometimes, of course, you will have that old paradigm about conflict, but it looks like there is that consciousness of being a sense of the colonial agency. In other words, it's a positioning that in refusing, for instance, the janusian, in refusing to totally belong, it is necessarily not, it's refusing anachronistic ways of looking at our contemporary time. When looking at various, the way we are now and the problems we face in the world within our post-colonial, if I can call, the post-colonial world, we have, as Spivak again will say, that the world is not well arranged, as Achebe will say. But we need to fight for a rearrangement of desires, as Spivak will say. And this is because the conviviality, acceptance of a difference, and the living within that difference, being one another's keeper. Once we have that, then we come together to be able to identify those pitfalls within melancholic pitfalls, which Guillory will call post-colonial melancholia. So we will have some of those issues to direct our struggle towards, in order to make it possible for us to have a better world in the 20th century, in the 21st century. And so those writers, when I was reading, the general perspective would be that it wasn't necessarily that the movement has been beneficiary to the certain. It is just like distancing yourself to be able to look at yourself and the world, the environment much better. In that way, you have that the colonial thrust, which then says, okay, now am I necessarily saying, okay, I'm Nigerian, and so I'm proud of it in spite of all the things that are happening in Nigeria there against the human beings, whether gender, whether ethnicity, whether race, and the politics of that. Now, from here, how can I then, in that sense, engage that within, from a post-colonial perspective within the world, and have allies to be able to point out and fight. And this is how all the time you have that sense of saying, no, there is a necessity for a rearrangement of desires in our present contemporary world. And so this is really what I liked about almost like all the essays, whether the Sankophone, the Janusian, or the new, you have that kind of perspective coming up on either out of concern with what is happening there to human beings, right? To be one another's brother's keeper. And that has been almost like activistic, as it were. So the generation of writers transcending, going all those, it's not necessarily like, okay, I'm here describing, look at how some of those characters. A person, for instance, in Bartholomew in Americana, who will then declare himself as a traditional African, use African tradition for the fulfillment of his modern desires. He's actually misusing it, deliberately manipulating it for that, and that is the thing. Those are the things that are, denounced, so that it is not possible for us to keep on, ill-treating, women, for instance, in terms of gender, or people in terms of sexuality, and others, because we are evoking, we are African, and so within Africa, it is almost like Africans have never, moved from they have statistically remained within the pre-colonial tradition. No, you know, hybridity has occurred, and within that, other subjectivities have emerged. And those are the subjectivities that then enable us to have intersubjective relationships with others, you know, within our post-colonial global world. And so that is what really makes this book, when I, you know, I was so happy when we finished that book and the perspective of looking at. And thank you very much yourself, who wrote a very, you know, an excellent essay, and the Joya as well on, you know.
Great. Well, thank you. I think you've also begun to answer the question that popped up from Gideon Brobe. Could you briefly talk about some major literary theoretical approaches that could be considered in discussing these generational movements in the African diaspora? And you were just referring to Spivak and the Gilroy and to feminism already. So I don't know if you want to add any more.
And the new empire and others. So we have okay, we have a whole, I outlined them in a different like Globalectics by Ngugi wa Thiong'o. Ngongi, who said Globalectics, which in final effect reinforces what he said before, that is displacing, decentering our word, so that, you know, the word is tackled from different perspectives. And so even in our articulations of aesthetics or planetary, you know, vision from there, as Spivak and Gilroy will suggest, planetary humanism, and then looking at the world from above and seeing that this is a limited space we have to share with the environment and others, so that all the concern with the environment, the concern with our own personal problems, all is seen from those various perspectives. And so we have a whole lot of, you know, those different ways designed to bring in to the center, you know, the world, so that we have different perspectives, and which is, again, as I'm saying, our word is that we are free of the different critical approaches used to be able to see the world from those various perspectives in general.
Tanure, you want the last word on this?
Yeah, I think, see, when you are editors of this massive type of work, you leave the writers, the scholars, to use as many of their own thinking, as much of their thinking as possible, as long as they were really looking at this phenomenon of the new diaspora. So we're very, I would say, liberal, that we allowed so many approaches, different approaches, as my colleague has said. So it's not something that we, the editors, determine. What we want is the new African diasporic literature, which we have already divided into 3 waves. But within examining them, critiquing them, you know, we allowed the scholars to approach them from different perspectives. And if you look at them, that's from feminist, interdisciplinary, a lot of things. When you look at different, even some
sexuality, from different
sexuality, looking at the environment, and so many things. So there were so many of them. And we as editors, we look at the final product of the essays. This essay is good for this thing. Yes, he has examined this something, thrown more light on what it means to be a diasporan, or the diasporic consciousness that we're looking for. So whatever contributed to the diasporic consciousness was okay with us, seen from any scholarly angle. Yeah.
Well, I commend your openness and your non-prescriptiveness.
That's right.
It's probably a really good approach to take. Now, I don't think there are any more questions I see in the chat, although we've had a fairly steady number of folks on the Zoom, sorry, on the YouTube chat. So I think I'm going to close it there and just say thank you very much indeed to you, Professor Ojaide and Professor Losambe. Thank you not just for this hour and a half that you've given us, but for the many, many hours you put into editing this absolutely massive collection. And that's a huge gift to everybody. I hope everybody's libraries at least are able to buy it. I dare say it's out of the price range of most of us to actually buy it as individuals. But it's a fabulous, fabulous book. So I hope folks will go and make sure that their libraries have it in stock. And then just to remind folks again of the ALA annual conference, it's the 50th annual conference, and we are going to be back on the continent for the first time in 10 years in Nairobi, June the 26th to the 28th. Both Joya and I have posted the CFP there in the chat, and it's also available on our ALA website at africanlit.org. And then 1 month from now, on October the 26th, please join us again on this same YouTube channel for the second in the 2024-2025 series, which will be given by Mohammed Kamara on the influence of colonial education in Francophone African literature. So for that, thank you again, Professors Losambe and Ojaide. It's been an absolute pleasure. And thank you to everybody for watching wherever you were in the world, the UK, the US, Nigeria, Canada, all over the place. It's been tremendous having these two fabulous scholars with us here today. And we'll see you again in 1 month's time. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much, Simon.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Okay, so we are gone?
Yeah, I think we are gone.
Okay.
Thank you, Lexi.